Shoko is astonished to discover that Shoya knows sign language. This will be the first of many scenes where Shoya's acquaintances are surprised that he knows sign language. Shoya, a deeply private person, has been teaching himself this skill for several years and has told no one else about it. Shoya says, "In the 17 years I've been alive, I've never once been a good person." I imagine that his mother, his sister, and his niece, to name just 3 people, would not agree with this assessment. This kind of all-or-nothing, black-and-white thinking is typical of Shoya's outlook, and is probably a major contributor to the depressed mood that has defined his adolescence. Shoya asks if they can be friends. Shoko grasps his hand in a manner that mirrors the scene from 5 years earlier. In both these scenes, her body language looks very tense, suggesting that clasping Shoya's hand is something that demands great courage on her part, almost as if she is expecting some sort of electric shock. Yaeko arrives to pick up Shoko. Her speech bubbles have just a few words and are printed in large text. Unlike Shoko and her sister, her grandmother, Shoya, and even Miyoko, Yaeko has never bothered to learn sign language. Yaeko instead communicates with her daughter by yelling simple sentences at her. Yaeko sees Shoya for the first time in 5 years. Her expression is unfathomable. Shoko doesn't want to leave until she has finished feeding the fish. Yaeko doesn't understand her. Shoko tries to sign her meaning, but Yaeko doesn't know sign language. Yaeko tries to conclude the situation by simply shouting even louder at Shoko and yanking on her arm. As with our first introduction to Yaeko, we are given the impression of a meek little girl being harassed by her overbearing mother. Shoya, who does know sign language, has to translate Shoko's thoughts for her mother. Once again, Yaeko's expression is unreadable. Yaeko notices that Shoko is carrying her old notebook. In a moment of impulsive rage, she hurls the book into the river. Shoko ends up in the water searching for her notebook. This is an obvious repeat of the scene from Volume 1. Shoya's annoyance with Shoko was caused by the fact that he couldn't understand her because he didn't know sign language. Yaeko's annoyance with Shoko has the same cause. Shoya didn't care whether or not he hurt Shoko's feelings. Yaeko's behaviour suggests the same attitude. Shoya was bullying Shoko. I don't think it's stretching the point to suggest that Yaeko, at various points in the story, appears to be bullying her own daughter. Watching silently, Yaeko observes her daughter's former bully leap into a river to save her, retrieve her book from the muddy waters, and finally communicate with her in sign language, something she herself cannot do. As she leads her daughter to their car, Shoya calls out that he regrets his past behaviour. Yaeko does not react to this, except to walk up quietly behind Shoya and strike him. Her face remains totally expressionless. The narrative flashes back to the 2 characters stood in the river. Shoya asks Shoko why the notebook means so much to her. Shoko says, "I gave up once before, but since you brought it back to me," and then holds the book to her breast. Later in this series we see Shoko's immediate response to losing her book in the pond, where she says that she wants to die. What does Shoko mean when she says, "I gave up"? And what is the significance of the book and the fact of Shoya's returning it to her? We might infer from her declaration to Yuzuru that gave up simply means gave up on life, but this explanation still doesn't really clarify the significance of the notebook. After saying hello, the first message that Shoko communicates to her classmates is, "I would like to get to know everyone through this notebook. When you want to talk to me, please use this notebook." The only occasions when her face registers genuine joy during her time in Mr. Takeuchi's class is when someone uses the book to ask her a question about herself, and when she uses the book to get to know Miyoko. Because the class rejected the opportunity to learn sign language, the book was her only means of communicating with her peers. Shoko tries 3 different methods of communication on Shoya: the written word, physical contact, and sign language. When all 3 fail to make an impression, Shoya flings her book into the pond and it is apparently lost forever. After this point we see no interactions between Shoko and any of her classmates. Over the course of the series we see no indication that she has any friends outside of the ones that Shoya brings to her. The notebook was her one connection between herself and her peers. While she could always buy another notebook and try again, the notebook symbolized her efforts to reach out and make an emotional connection with the people around her. When all forms of communication fail and the notebook is lost, it's easy to understand how a child could invest this event with a great deal of significance and take it as a reason to give up hope of ever making a real friend. I think this is what she means by "I gave up." She gave up on trying to connect to the people around her. The loss of the notebook was the event that shifted her mindset away from trying to make friends and towards being insular. The boy that she desperately tried to communicate with has sought her out and returned the item that signified her connection with the outside world. The loss of the book signalled the loss of the hope that she could ever connect with the people around her. The return of the book therefore signals the reinstatement of that hope. When understood in this way, it becomes clear why the notebook, at this point in the story, is imbued with an immense amount of emotional significance for Shoko. When Shoya recalls Shoko's words, he fails to comprehend their significance and simply thinks, "What a weirdo." These are the same words that he blurted out when he first saw her 5 years earlier. After all this time, this incomprehensible girl remains a source of fascination for him. When Shoya returns the following week, Yuzuru has elected to stand guard so that she can keep Shoya away from Shoko. Shoko apparently forgives Shoya the instant he returns her book to her. Yuzuru does not share Shoko's superhuman capacity for forgiveness. Shoya and Shoko share a mutual desire to become friends. Yuzuru believes it is in Shoko's best interests to prevent this from happening. Yuzuru manages to weaken Shoya's resolve by exploiting a vulnerability in his personality. She asks, "Are you really her friend?" Shoya is dumbfounded by the question. After Yuzuru shuts the door on him, the question echoes in his consciousness for days. He wonders how friendship starts and what the concept even means. He becomes acquainted with Tomohiro and then is surprised to discover that Tomohiro already thinks that they are friends. He asks Tomohiro what it means to be friends. Tomohiro rejects Shoya's assumption that there is any value in trying to figure out the answer to such questions. Shoya replies that there are situations where one must earn the right to be friends. He poses his situation as a hypothetical about a boy who doesn't know whether he deserves to be friends with a girl. Tomohiro once again regards Shoya's logic as irrelevant and simply suggests that he speak to the girl and see what she says. He finally dismisses Shoya's conceptions entirely by suggesting that friendship is deeper than words or logic. In other words, telling Shoya that he won't find an answer to his conundrum through logic, because logic is not relevant to the issue at hand. What we see in this scene is a collision between intellectualism and pragmatism. Shoya likes to conceive of things in terms of systems, rules, and principles, and seeks to understand his position within the system that supposedly undergirds the concept of friendship. Tomohiro thinks more in terms of action and experience. He rejects the belief that there are coherent rules underlying the concept of friendship, and believes that the way to clarify social situations is through social interaction, not through ruminations and theories. Without Tomohiro's perspective, Shoya might have given up on his pursuit of Shoko. Yuzuru's question exploited Shoya's over-reliance on using logic to understand others. Tomohiro's insight provided Shoya with a solution to his dilemma and gave him the rationale that he needed to return to Shoko's sign language class once more. Yuzuru stymies Shoya once more with the line, "If you're just here to satisfy yourself, you should leave." Once again, Yuzuru seems to have stumbled on a line of argument that exploits one of Shoya's weaknesses, the tendency to obsess over whether his motivations are honourable. Ultimately, I think it doesn't matter too much how their discussion plays out. Yuzuru doesn't want to grant access, and Shoya is not assertive enough to demand access. Just as in the case of Shoya's discussion with Tomohiro, picking delicately through rational arguments won't generate a solution to this situation. A more assertive person is required to step in and take charge. Tomohiro intervenes and demonstrates two characteristics that will recurrently irritate Shoya throughout the series. Firstly, he followed Shoya without his permission. Tomohiro is very possessive with Shoya. Secondly, he swings into the situation like a wrecking ball, causes a huge scene and embarrasses Shoya. In theory, these are two very negative characteristics, but the practical result is that Shoko discovers that Shoya has returned to see her and runs after him. It is not obvious that Shoya would have been able to circumvent Yuzuru and see Shoko a second time were it not for Tomohiro's clumsy interference. When Yaeko appears at the salon at 3 a.m, she is carrying 3 umbrellas, one for herself, Yuzuru, and Shoko. When the Nishimirs are reunited, Shoya is crouched nearby behind a tree. Yaeko walks up to him just to stare at him in her expressionless manner and give him one of their 3 umbrellas. This seems like an oddly symbolic gesture when you consider that she and her daughters still need to walk home in the rain, but Shoya's mother is in a car a few feet away. Before she leaves, she says to Shoya, "No matter what you do now, you can't erase the pain you've caused her." Considering that Shoya's whole reason for living at this point is to undo the pain he's caused, Yaeko's words are just about the most hurtful thing she could possibly tell Shoya. This is similar to the moment she throws Shoko's notebook off the bridge. In both these moments, she appears to be doing something impulsive and unconsidered, but at the same time she somehow strikes upon the meanest possible thing that she could do or say. It's not easy to account for her behaviour in this scene, first performing the oddly symbolic act of handing him an umbrella that she needs much more than he does, and then saying the most unkind thing she could possibly say. All I can suggest is that Yaeko's character includes two very prominent and contradictory elements. On the one hand, an extremely conscientious and noble self-image, which demands that she behave in an honourable way, like doing a favour for the boy who has helped retrieve her missing daughter, and on the other hand, barely suppressed feelings of bitterness and rage that compel her to lash out at those around her at seemingly random moments. At this point in the narrative, I'd guess that she has realised that Shoya is a good kid who is working hard to make amends for his past sins, but that at an emotional level she can't forgive him for what he once did, simply because forgiveness is not something that comes easily to her. Yuzuru comes over to retrieve some stuff she left at Shoya's and to apologise, but Tomohiro has to make a big song and dance of the whole affair. First he claims that he has caught Yuzuru red-handed. Next he demands to know how close Shoya and Yuzuru are in response to finding out that Yuzuru slept at Shoya's place. Next he snatches Yuzuru's camera and finds the photo of Shoya jumping off the bridge, even though Yuzuru already confessed to taking the photo. He orders Yuzuru to apologise, even though she said she was going to apologise anyway. He goes so far as to force her head down into a bowing position. His behaviour clearly annoys Yuzuru and makes Shoya and his mother uncomfortable. With his histrionic behaviour, it's not hard to see why he has so few friends, in spite of his charming and gregarious demeanour. Shoko seems quite upset and unhappy as she apologises for Yuzuru's behaviour and as they part company. But when Shoya does the sign for later, she suddenly seems relieved. It seems that she was afraid that Shoya might have been angry at both of them because of the trouble that Yuzuru had caused, and that he might not want anything more to do with them. Shoko and Shoya appear to be suffering from the same feelings, a desire to develop their friendship and a fear that some mischance might scupper that development. Shoko smiles at Shoya. The smile prompts an internal monologue that is presented in such a way that it could be read as belonging to Shoya or Yuzuru or both. That these two could essentially share the same internal monologue should make it clear to the reader, if it is not already clear, that Shoya and Yuzuru share the same primary goal in life, one that is totally invested in Shoko and her well-being. We can admire these two for their selflessness, but we should also remember that Shoko is responsible for placing an immense burden on both of them, even if this was not her intention. Disability can make a person somewhat helpless, but Shoko's unassuming, self-loathing and excessively agreeable personality has made her more helpless than the average person with the same disability. Shoko's sense of herself as a burden to those around her is one that causes her great distress and is a theme that will be developed in later volumes. Shoya feels happy when he sees Shoko's smile, but then he remembers his school friends and the way he treated Shoko, and he feels downhearted. His change of mood must be outwardly apparent because Tomohiro asks him what's wrong. We see almost the exact same sequence occur earlier in the book. Shoya is enjoying Tomohiro's company, but then he remembers his old friends and Shoko, and he feels sad again. In this instance too, Tomohiro notices the change in Shoya and asks him what's wrong. The most obvious conclusion we can draw from these two moments is that Shoya has a face that tends to show his feelings. We could also conclude that Tomohiro is someone who is very receptive to subtle changes of mood in the people around him. It's also interesting to note that on both occasions the memory that upsets Shoya is depicted with not one or two, but 4 characters. In both cases it is himself, Shoko, Keisuke and Kazuki. This suggests that Shoya's prolonged depression is rooted in 2 distinct emotions. On the one hand, his feelings of guilt and responsibility for Shoko. On the other hand, his sense of loss regarding his close bond with his childhood friends. Over the course of this series, Shoya invests much thought and energy into dealing with his feelings concerning Shoko, but seems more inclined to suppress and ignore his feelings concerning his former friends. As difficult and painful as his history with Shoko may be, it seems that his history with his lost friends is even more painful and difficult, to the extent that Shoya simply abandons all hope of ever coming to terms with it. His feelings of guilt concerning Shoko are easier for Shoya to process than his sense of rejection concerning his friends.